Warhol's a really fascinating character and really crucial in the history of art in the United States. He was born in Pittsburgh, brought up in kind of a working class family, Catholic, and I think that's important because he was exposed to a lot of this really glitzy, over-the-top Catholic art from a young age, and that was definitely influential later in his career. Came to New York City in the 1950s, where he really started making a name for himself as a graphic designer, making illustrations for shoe companies, things like that. And he really came into his own at this time when really abstract art ruled the day. We're thinking about the 1950s. Artists like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning were really the most important players on the art scene in the United States. Warhol really countered all that by making figurative art and by really pioneering what we now call the pop art movement, where he was co-opting imagery from everyday life, really, from magazines, advertisements, commercial imagery, and putting that into his art and really doing what I like to call breaking down that barrier between art and life, where artists like the abstract expressionists, that's a group of artists that encompass Jackson Pollock, they're creating something that's art for art's sake. It's really separate. It's shown in galleries. Not that Warhol's art wasn't all of that, but Warhol is using very recognizable imagery and putting it into his art and really challenging previous assumptions about what art could be.
The high point was the opening of the exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, when so many people came that they had to take all the pictures down, and thousands of people jammed in there, and there were no pictures to speak of, just you. And you had the real character of a celebrity there, the kind of celebrity we really haven't had in American art. Do you realize that?
Oh, it was so really and glamorous.
Well, Andy, do you have any thoughts at all about the fact that so many people like the idea of just being able to watch you sitting in a chair or standing on a balcony selling soup cans?
But that won't last very long.
You don't think so?
No. Because just sitting there, that's really doesn't mean anything. But what I really want to do is, I guess, do some movies.
But he had really varied imagery, and I think part of it is kind of his personal idiosyncratic taste, what was interesting to him. But there are kind of some unexpected themes that connect these seemingly disparate subjects. For example, so Marilyn Monroe. So we have these beautiful prints of Marilyn Monroe, and we think of her as being really iconic, but I think it's Warhol who actually made her so iconic. I mean, if you asked a 17-year-old today who she was, they probably wouldn't know, except for the fact that Warhol, made this ubiquitous image of her. So the prints of Marilyn Monroe were made shortly after her tragic death in the early 1960s by suicide, and Warhol was really interested in how she wasn't just an individual anymore, she actually was a product. And so that's kind of how it relates to the Campbell soup cans. So he took a publicity still from the movie Niagara, and he took kind of a detail of her face from that still and repeated it over and over in different colors in these prints, thinking about the way that her identity sort of became a commodity through the marketing of her films and of her celebrity. And so where's the divide between the person and the cult of personality? Is Marilyn Monroe just as much a product as a can of Campbell soup on the supermarket shelf? I think the Mao prints are really interesting. So Warhol originally made paintings, and then he later editioned them as prints, as silkscreens. And the paintings of Mao were made the same year that President Nixon traveled to China. So there was sort of this communication happening between our antagonistic countries for really the first time. The images that Warhol produced of Mao are actually still controversial in China because he's sort of parodying him, and much like the Monroe prints, Chairman Mao looks as if he's wearing makeup. Warhol said, "I thought it would be fun to have Mao as a fashion figure." So it's almost heretical to kind of this leader of the Communist Party in China, and he's thinking again about the commodification of his face, his personality. The image for those prints was taken from the cover of Mao's manifesto, known as the Little Red Book, and so it's another image that's absolutely ubiquitous, and it makes you question how much of this is real and how much is invented for the sake of marketing.
Well, I don't really paint because I hate objects, and I hate to go to museums and see pictures of Warhol because they look so important and they don't really mean anything.
One could think of Warhol as being political. He had kind of several different personas, and I think when we hear his famous quotations about everyone being famous for 15 minutes, I think he was really deliberately cultivating a persona that's sort of apolitical and almost superficial. There are scholars who would make an argument that his work is actually deeply political. I think it's really all how you read into it. I think so. We have works from his so-called Death and Disaster series. The works that we have are images of an electric chair. It's actually specifically the electric chair where Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed after being convicted of spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. And I think one could kind of read those as an argument against the death penalty. What I think Warhol was ultimately trying to say about it was actually more about the power of imagery and the way that when even a grisly image is repeated over and over and over, we sort of become numb to it and we're no longer susceptible to kind of that shock on the first sight of it. It's really in the eye of the beholder, and I think Warhol kind of deliberately cultivated this air of sort of opacity when it came to that.
This is like sitting at the World's Fair, riding one of those Ford machines where the voice is behind you. It's so exciting. You don't have to think anything. But you should just tell me the words and I can just repeat them because I can't. I'm so empty today. I can't think of anything. Why don't you just tell me the words and they'll just come out of my mouth.
Well, I've been working on this project 16 years since I started my master's thesis in 2003 at the University of Oklahoma to finally getting it open earlier this year here at the booth. When I was the first employee here at the museum in 2000 and started looking into the collection that we had available, it was generally a pretty traditional Western art collection, but then lo and behold, here were these 14 Warhol images, and they kind of seemed out of place. It seemed an anomaly within the Western art collection that was here, within Western art in general, and within Andy's oeuvre. Who knew that he did any Western art? And here were these 14 images. So that kind of became a quest to find out why here, why now, why then, why Andy, why the West, all those things. And was this project, the Cowboys and Indians that we're sitting amongst, were they something that comes out of nowhere, or was this something he had been dealing with, doing Western things throughout? It just was such a big oeuvre and such a big output that you didn't really perceive it. And so if it had been the former, that would have made about a 2-page paper. But it was the latter, and it became a 110-page paper, and ultimately led to this exhibition 15 years later. And it led to a 144-page book, of which the guts in the beginning, at least, of the book are from that thesis that was originally published academically in 2005. So 10 years, 14 years later, here we are with a major exhibition and a book to boot. I think I'm the only expert on Warhol in the West. We brought in some other people to do some essays for the book. I had a co-curator who they both have certainly spun up and become experts in the niches that they wrote about in the exhibition. But as far as anybody who's done an overview study, I'm it as far as we know. And I say that as humbly as I can.
The section we're in right now is called Cowboys and Indians, and it was Andy Warhol's last major project before his passing in 1987. And there were going to be 250 of these portfolios made available to the public to purchase. And you could purchase a series for $15,000 at that time. And it was always planned that there would only be 10, but in doing the research and trying to narrow down images for it, they chose 14 subjects, 14 different subjects. And so, for example, one of the subjects was the 1913 buffalo nickel, and on the other side was the Indian head nickel. And so that one may have been settled by Kleinman always thinking, well, I'm only going to do one side of this coin in the portfolio, so maybe they just flipped a coin to decide which one, and it ended up being the Indian head that stayed in the portfolio, and buffalo nickel here behind us did not. in this deal with Kent Kleinman, something went wrong and Andy lost some legal control that he normally had, and it ended up that Kent Kleinman had the final say on the color combinations, and you'll notice there are 14 prints in here, so he had the final say on which 10 would make it into the final portfolio, and that caused Andy a huge amount of stress. It delayed the project. It made it the most contentious and upsetting project of his entire career. Because he passed away before some of the images were even finished, like normally he would have an original painting that went with each of these serigraphs. Because of that, a lot of people weren't aware that this ever existed, and a lot of research, or any research, was ever done on it until Seth uncovered that.
The biggest thing was to really take advantage of the enormous amount of research already been done on him. I mean, he's the most documented artist perhaps in the history of America. There are more books about him than maybe the next 5 artists put together, I would guess. He's the most overexposed, overwritten about, over-exhibited artist in American history. Yet there was still 144 pages worth of scholarship on his relation to the West available to be discovered by the people we had working on the project. And that's quite amazing.
The way it worked was a gentleman, he was an artist in New York named Edmund Galtney, and he came up with the idea of broaching Andy with this as an idea for a series to put together. And so he needed financial backing, so he met with Kent Kleinman, a New York investment banker, and they approached Andy with the idea of doing this series. Edmund just wanted to do Indians only, Native Americans only, and Kent encouraged him to make it both cowboys and Indians, thinking that would be more marketable to the general public. And so in 1986, they began working on the series, printing this series.
Truth be told, he probably would not have done this body of work had not somebody proposed it to him. But that's the case with a lot of his work. The money was really made in the Warhol realm on these print portfolios where they picked a subject, they did 10 prints, they experimented with the color combinations, they picked out the one of each of those 10 subjects they thought would be commercially viable, and then they ran 150 to 300 copies, times 10, times 1,000, 1,500 bucks a piece at the time they were selling them. The numbers add up pretty quickly on those things. So while it wasn't purely his idea to do this project, he was approached by a publisher who wanted to do it. He certainly had an affinity for it and readily agreed. You know, if it was a subject he didn't want to do, he wouldn't have done it.
It was all about multiples and making money. And so, you know, it would have been impossible physically for him to do all this. And so Rupert J. Smith was his printer. And Andy would be there and they would work on possible color combinations when they were choosing which colors to lay down for each print. And then they would evaluate them and decide which one, again, would be more marketable, which color combination would the public appreciate the most or be most inclined to purchase. And so Andy had say in it, but he wasn't doing the hands-on nitty-gritty.
I don't think anybody that grew up in the age that he did was immune to Western movies. He went to the movies almost every Saturday, said those were his happiest times growing up, and he would have seen a ton of Gene and Roy movies. In his celebrity scrapbook that he kept as a young child, there are pictures of Gene and Roy. So maybe he wasn't as weird as we think he is. Well, maybe he is, but he liked Gene and Roy at least, so that makes him okay in our book on that account at least. And you know, he grew up dreaming about the West. In his book Dream America, he talks about dreaming what it was like in other parts of the country, and he mentions particularly Texas and out west. And again, that would have stemmed from his interest in Western movies. In his collection, when he died, they found a Roy Rogers alarm clock. They found little giant books that he had on the West. He wore Western cowboy boots almost every day. When interviewers described what he was wearing, it was just about always cowboy boots. There's 27 pair of them at the Warhol Museum. We have 5 here in the exhibition. So from an early age, I think he was enamored with the West. He had an interest in it. He owned property in Colorado. He traveled out there a lot. traveled through Texas, New Mexico a fair bit. He made a couple of Western movies. So there's a lot of Western things within his lifetime. It's just they're a little bit few and far between and buried under a lot of other things that had to be rooted out and stitched together. My favorite piece here in the Cowboys and Indians suite is the action picture. It's the one based on the Schreivogel painting. And I love the painting so much, that's probably why I like the print. And ironically, it's one of the ones that didn't make the cut to be in the top 10 that were published and had the edition prints made. When I asked the publisher, who was the only person alive at the time I was doing this research that was directly involved, he said it just didn't go with the others. They were all either static portraits or static still lives, and that one just had too much going on in it to fit with the rest, which is probably why I love it. It has so much going on in it, and it's called Action Picture because of all the action in it. In the other part of the exhibition, my favorite piece has become, and it's really grown on me, is the Georgia O'Keeffe with the diamond dust on it. It just sparkles, it's got that bling effect. It was done like a photographic negative, giving her a ghost-like appearance, and it really looks like she's looking right through you. It's such an intense portrait. But I have many, many favorites. Howdy Doody's another favorite. He also has the diamond dust kind of blinged out a little bit. A lot of people say they're freaked out by that. People don't like clowns and puppets, but I think it's a cool image. So I think for people who are Andy Warhol fans, it's fun to see them come in and realize what he did that was Western and that they might not have been aware of, and to remind them about his oeuvre being so big and so wide and so voluminous that we're still finding out things that he did 30, 40 years later and saying, wow, I didn't know he did that. And so to see all those presented here, it's been fun to see the people that thought they were familiar with him to discover him anew in that way. On the flip side, I think our Western core audience who may have a negative idea of Andy, and there's plenty not to like about him, whether it be his personality or his enabling of people and encouraging people to do not so tasteful things or even not so tasteful art that he created that might turn you off, but to come and see the artwork that's here and realize he was as American and into the West as anybody, and to create a body of work that they could enjoy and perhaps even celebrate, yet they thought there was nothing redeeming about him. It's a G-rated body of work. You're not going to run across anything that's going to freak you out or make you feel uncomfortable. It's firmly rooted in the West and American ideals and Western history. Maybe Lonesome Cowboys gets a little close to that edge, but certainly we've been careful to, present it in such a way it's not going to offend anybody, I don't think. And that, we're talking about the most famous artists in American history, tackling maybe our most famous period or our most famous iconic genre of Western art. And you put those two together, it's important. And it's something that if you're a Western fan or an art fan, it's something you ought to pay attention to. And it certainly has ripple effect throughout the rest of Western art to today in terms of artists who are creating Western subjects. Many of them, either consciously or unconsciously, have been influenced by Andy, his working methods, and his images.